10 floors. 13.3 down 9, roughly 4.3 to 4.4. 12 up to 16.4, 4.4, right? Math is not rocket science. You take 4% off of one budget, you're going to get it down the road to the next budget, right? Unless we just absolutely eliminate some things that cause that. So, point is that as this nice discussion goes forward, we can talk about reducing that 16.4, which some of you have asked me to present some information on that in your comments. We can absolutely do that. That's a conscious choice you all probably need to make. Just know that you have to make a choice. You can either pushing that out or eliminating it altogether. So 16.4 down to say 10, which is some of the guidance I've gotten from some counselors. 6.4, what does that look like added to 5.2? We're at another 10% next year. I will tell you that the average out of this 10-year levy increase is around 8%. So, and I want to be clear here. I'm not scolding anyone, or I'm not telling anyone shame on you. I actually think it's a good idea to level things out, right? That is my general budget philosophy. Rather than lips and tools, try to level things out. So, in very general, unmathematical, you figured out terms, 8-9% is a sustainable increase across the board for 10 years. That being said, that's going to get tiresome on a 10-year plan. 8-9% after a while is going to really be tough to continue to look at. So again, there's simple choices. Sort of a band-aid ripping off, one-time big increase, followed by some more reasonable ones, or sort of middle of the road. Give me a punch in the arm every year instead of a big punch in the gut one year and then not so don't touch for the rest of it, right? So I know I'm talking anecdotally and not with real numbers necessarily, but that's the kind of the choices that we wrestle with, right, for the next few months. So, okay, back to the memo. What we wanted to do, and maybe we can even just skip to the pie chart here, which is that.
Yeah. We just pull that up here, we don't have the biases up because we don't have it. So that would be nice for half phone.
Do you have your computer that I could use? Because mine is being used for live streaming right now.
I don't know if that can help.
Yeah, I can just so. So in the bunch he pulls that up, we'll just kind of skip to the pie chart here, which is it showed the components of that 2.5 million or that 16.4%. So general inflation was about 21% of that pie, which is when I think in terms of 16.4, it's 3.4%. Not over 16.4, you know what I mean? Mm-hmm. So as we're adding 3.4% is just general inflation. Now that's just an assumption built into this model. It was set at 4%. As we know, for a few years here now, that's been too low. If you think back to the mid-2000s, that was way too high. Your guess is as good as mine going into the next year. I think 4% is realistic and yet a little conservative, probably. I do think we can get some leveling out. I think last month the numbers came out as like 2 point something like that, mid twos. That paper year over year, I think April's numbers were. But of course, some of the things are lagging indicators too. That CPI that we normally hear in the news tends to be out there ahead on the retail market. Things like salaries that usually then creep up after that are a big part of what's going to go into our inflationary costs, right? We've got contracts that we're gonna be negotiating into 2026 that are gonna want 3 years ago, it's inflation, right? Then staff additions is 30% of that pie. And, or 4.9, almost 5% of that 16.4 is staff additions. So that's certainly something that, should be discussed.
That doesn't include ones that have been approved, the budget for this year, that's additional.
Correct.
Right?
That's 2026, people. Although it is part of what was looked at as the 10-year staffing plan. So this isn't things that people just invented this year. This is something that people contemplated last year, and you at least gave sort of tacit approval of that, whether or not, you know, obviously you're going to revisit that every year, but we sort of endorsed this 10-year plan, right? So then 18% or 3% of that total, of that 3% of that 16.4 was the North Shore Trail debt service. And at this point, that is pretty well locked in. You can, I suppose, say, whoops, we should just cancel that, but that would be very foolish at this point. We got a very good price, and as mentioned, you know, we probably got $100,000 or two just because we go over the contract and all that stuff.
There's never reflecting the lower payment.
It is, yep.
Okay.
Oh, I'm sorry, it does not. That 18, that this is kind of like based on the old numbers. We'll forget that.
Okay.
But you know, not too far off that number. General fund reserve. So you'll remember this, the 1.6% there, or 10% of the total. That is this number that was not previously being done, and I think it was a wise decision to incorporate that. And again, that comes with the idea that when you want to maintain a fund balance at a certain percentage, you have to over budget. And that's what that number, that's at that line item is, because you're trying to get to 50% of the, actually it's the coming year's budget, right? And that number keeps creeping up. And so in order to keep that same percentage, the dollar amount has to go up. It's a tough concept sometimes for people to understand. Why can't we just have a balanced budget and stay at 50%? Well, you could if the budget was flat, you had a 0% increase, but that's not very realistic. So then the last one there, the 20% of this pie, or 3.3% of the 16.4, is the program capital fund increases. And now remember, this is what you're putting into the capital funds. So you took a look at the 10-year capital fund and said, we're going to buy a fire truck this year, we're going to buy 2 police cars that year, we're going to buy a pickup and a plow truck this year. Blend all that together, amalgamated it into one blob or a couple of blobs, and then said, in order to keep that 10-year plan solvent, so those funds from dipping into the red, here's what we're going to have to do on a year-by-year basis. 100,000 into this fund, 300,000 into that fund, $500,000 into this fund. The portion of that that is going up from 25 to 26 is this 20% of that fund. Again, it's a number we can talk about. It's a matter of whether or not what that does down the road, right? So that is sort of the 5 elements of, you know, that really matter in this increase. We could talk about $20,000 here and there, but these are the big numbers. Some of you asked to take a look. So on the next page now, this table is about the average impact on a home. Some of you had asked to see that information. Again, this is the impact of that increase. So you look in, you know, I think that 399 is probably the median value home, just nodding your head. That's just, these are all just inflated from last year's numbers in terms of the market value. The increase there, you know, in the mid 200s to up to 300, lower $300 or $300 a year in taxes to a sort of an average home. Not insignificant. That's $25 a month, right? So that's enough to be noticed. Yeah. Then what we wanted to do is say, okay, that was the 10-year plan as we started the year, so nothing changing. We would stick with that plan. Then we wanted to look at a few things that have changed for better or for worse. So in 2026 outlook, we looked at it and said, well, in this spreadsheet here, again, I highlighted, so on page Page 1. I've got the 95,000 squared out there in red. That number is low. That's how much we're making in interest. We made a little bit over 200,000 this last year. I think it was 230-ish, maybe something like that neighborhood. I think conservatively, you can still put 200 there and feel a little good about the fact that we're going to hit that. A lot of our stuff is in long-term interest-bearing accounts, CDs. When I say long-term, I mean like years, not long-term, but the cities that is. So, not a lot of our stuff is real volatile. The market was to crash in terms of interest rates. We'd be still okay for this budget year. Now, of course, we don't know. So that has to be thought about too. You can up your revenue expectations in your budget, which lowers your levy for this year. But then when that, and that will reflect reality, right? But then next year, if interest rates come down, or the year after, you're going to need to reduce your revenue expectations. Again, that will track with reality, but that is, again, going to set you up for having to, knowing that that's an eventuality, right? So you can continue to leave it where it is, knowing that that's conservative, and a lot of us do try to be as real conservative with that interest. Not saying it's a bad idea to ramp it up just because we know that it's pretty factual that will happen. North Shore Trail, we did have some good news there. We have savings of approximately 52,000. That one is squared on page 2 of your sheet there. I haven't redlined that, but that 430 is now 380. So that's a nice savings there. Then staffing is sort of at this point, we feel like it is neutral to the 10-year plan. So neutral to this document, right? We're still adding 740,000 to the current plans that sits today. But to this document, to that 16.4, we're still at that neutral spot with what we're proposing. Contracts coming up. So what I don't believe was programmed into this particular 10-year plan was any out of the ordinary contracting. So certainly there is a 4% escalator for expenses, and that expenses is labor. If we believe that upcoming labor contracts will exceed that 4%, that is not in here. I do believe that our police contracts, the 2 police contracts, will likely exceed 4% at least during one of the years of the 3-year contract. What that will really look like is yet to be seen. My previous job, we negotiated a contract with our police that was north of 4% first year of the contract, and then fell back to 2% the next 2 years. It's sort of more normal cost of it. But it was a pretty substantial increase in that 1 year. So right now, just back in the napkin sketch estimates, I've been seeing that as around a $250,000 addition to the budget. That wasn't thought about in the 2026 10-year plan, as far as I can tell. As far as just right. Next one is the classic comp study. We don't know for sure what that will say. Maybe it'll say everything's hunky-dory. Maybe aside from the police, it'll say here. And plus or minus here and there comes out to maybe be a wash. I think conservatively, though, I think most often when we do this, it'll end up being that you're a bit behind, right? I think especially given some conservative budgeting we've had over the last decade or so. Since the last time we did this, it's not, it wouldn't be out of range for it to see some sort of increase. I did some back of the napkin sketching on that, thought about what that percent increase might look like across the entire staff. Put that number here, and I think that's about $100,000. And that's just my best guess at this point. We won't know that information until September. Maybe not even fully until this correction. Yep.
On that, I know that what our budget was for this year, if you recall, and how negotiations went with the current one we just got done with. We were concerned that we didn't have enough there. Where did that land?
I mean, we landed at 3% increases, and so In the, if the assumption was that 4% escalator, then we came out and that was conservative then, that line item. Where that ends up in terms of actual costs of fit for EE, you just would have to spend a couple of days sorting out staff absences from that savings. It would be a bit of an exercise. I say we should do it at some point, but we haven't done that yet. But yeah, I think a 3% is definitely a conservative win for the budget. So those are kind of the main elements, and then kind of the big matzo ball here, the general fund reserve. So the 2024 numbers are in, sort of. So they're still unaudited, but they've been audited, but they haven't completed the final document. So
I
we're all-
did good corrects today,
Oh,
and
you did?
I can say the number went up from 950 to almost 1 million.
okay. That's all good news. Way to go, Jessica. Because it's all her doing. So again, we're not squabbling over 50,000 here. We're talking about big numbers. Last year, for lack of a better term, we will show that we were under budget by $1 million. How did that happen? It happened because there was no me in any permanent role. There was absences here, there, and everywhere. That adds up pretty quickly. Have staff absences. Some of that was offset by consultant costs, I'm sure, but in the long run, we ended up very far under budget. That's great news. I want to bury the lead, and that's good news. What is difficult always for folks to understand is what it looks like to incorporate that into a budget savings going forward. So the easy, I don't call it temptation, but the immediate no-brainer answer is use that $1 million to not have a big increase next year. We can absolutely do that. But everyone to understand that we can do that. What I want to warn against, though, is that that does not slow the expenses growth. And what you will end up with is a nicer number this year in 2026, a much worse number in 2027 if you don't end up your $1 million under budget. Now, you can start to predict after one quarter of 2025 where we'll end up at the end of 25, but that's a little bit of a dangerous road to go down, right? So again, what you could do is you could buy down the levy increase for 2026 by using this $1 million. That's a big chunk of $2.5 million. But what it will mean is that the levy increase percentage will look much worse than the 2027 year. You follow the same pattern. So it's a choice between, so the other things that my recommendation would be to do is to not do that, but rather either A, save that money, just let it sit in the general fund, and know that it's there when you have a one-time capital project to do. And we all know that there's a one-time capital project coming here at the whole Woods Building. Sometimes people just don't feel real comfortable with that. We got a policy that says 50%, we got to get down to 50% fund balance. If you feel that way, my next recommendation would be that go ahead and transfer that money out of the general fund, just general fund levy balance, into one of your capital funds. And then let that buy the capital fund down. And what we would do is sort of recalibrate that capital fund and look at what keeps it solvent. And so the amount we would put into the levy, the amount we put into the budget each year from the general levy to that capital fund could be reduced. Generally speaking, that would water down that savings just because you're going to spread it out over a longer period of time with that capital plan. You can arrange it so it doesn't quite do that. But that really does buy down then your expenses going forward, right? So that's a real reduction in your expenses going forward. You could really reduce spending by doing that without kicking any cans down the road, right? The only thing it does is just means you got less sitting around when it comes time to buy a capital expense that wasn't planned for the capital funds. That's where we're at with the public works building, right? Every $1 million we have sitting around to help pay for that is another $1 million we have to bond for when it comes time to do that. That $1 million of bonding equates to about $2 million of actual money paid out plus years of that bond, right? So much like you do at home, a lot of times you sit on money to buy something rather than, spending it now and taking one out later, right? So those are my two suggestions. Again, suggestion 3 can be just buy this year's down, get that number lower.
Question that surplus is there a policy that guides us on what we should do with that? I feel like there is one based on my past conversations with Kevin. Don't necessarily know any past policies I've followed, but I'm just curious if there's some policy guidance.
It's a good question. If I haven't looked into that, I don't know.
I don't know off the top of my head either. I can take a look at that.
I don't know.
Yeah, like help your decision making regarding your policy. That says, hey, don't even Davey, don't. That's really good.
I don't remember off the top of my head.
So somewhat related, we're saying that most of this extra or where everybody was positions, other than your position and here we are in May, nothing's changed. Presumably, by the time we get filled in September, how does that play into that? Is that something we can safely bank on? I mean,
Yeah, I mean, I think we could certainly come up with a conservative estimate of what we think we'll save this year. Look at what that surplus will be next year. Again, it's going to be kind of I'll use the term one-time savings, right? It's not a structural savings in our expenses. And so my last finance director always just said, one-time savings should always be used on one-time expenses. It's just a good budget philosophy. Otherwise, you end up with that needing to catch up at some point. I mean, unless you don't care what that, I mean, just to the citizen, it's not any skin off their back. If you buy down next year's budget, that's great. That's great because it's a real savings for them of $1 million, right? It's just that has to look a lot tougher next year. And it's no different whichever way you do it. You don't lose that $1 million in which way you shuffle the cards, right? It just looks different.
so my initial thought on that on this is that, so if we have we want to hold a fund, a policy to hold a 50% fund balance, we have $500,000 here, and also we have another $1 million, and then we've got other sewer and water accounts that have money. Perception could be there's just a lot of money we're continuing to tax at double digit increases. That optic is not good, although I think maybe it's not right. There's something to think of even down the road. Thanks.
So I think that the bottom line, unfortunately, the unfortunate bottom line here is with those ups and downs, not excluding the $1 million savings, the real increase projected next year is 18.3 because of some of the wage adjustments that we're conservatively estimating as well as non-negotiated contracts. So rather than 16.4, we really should be talking about 18.2. So it's not getting better.
So you get two microphones.
What?
I think it's this next page, or 322. A little bit after this, yeah, that's pretty much. I guess table.
So we started out with a $2.5 million increase. We went down, or pretty good, because of interest income. We went down 50,000 because of North Shore Trail bond being lower. Staffing additions were neutral. The police union contract is anticipated to add 250,000. And the class comp study is looking to add, or predicting to add 100,000. And I guess I didn't talk about, but we we are looking at, picking out the comp plan process, our zoning plan, right? It's probably. It was. So, someone had asked too, like, I think maybe Laban said, it's nice to know sometimes what a percentage is, so we can start to think in terms of how much to take to get rid of a percent on that 18 million. But, in very rough terms, you got a $15 million budget that you're up against comparing to, so $150,000 is a percent. So you want to get that number down, I think in terms of chunks of $150,000. That roughly is a staff person, right? Depends on salary, obviously, but hovers around that number in the total cost of benefits of it. So 1%, one staff person.
Well, that's one area, but I mean, it's budget. What we've tried to do the last couple of years is have a lot of money to infrastructure, whether that's roads, sewers, parks, there's capital equipment. The whole, it's much better budgeting process. It's, some of it, to your point, I mean, you end up sitting on a bunch of cash here and spend money on a park or what have you. So, big numbers.
Yeah, and I think you go back to that pie chart, to your point, like when 18% of that increase is just newly programmed capital expenses, right? That's 18% of the increase, right? So we're not 18% isn't capital of our total expenditures. That's 18% of what we are increasing. And that, I think to your point, it shows that, gosh, that's an awful lot. We were that far behind, right? So in terms of saving the capital fund, capital improvements.
When you look at parks, I mean, I think I recall we were asked for 500,000 back in 24. We knocked that down to 100. Then we went to 350, and now we're looking at, not quite double it, but move it up. And fortunately, it's a couple of council members that, people were present for those conversations, but it's not like the money's not needed, fortunately. From a obsolescence standpoint.
On the part, since we mentioned 600, that's just full levy in. What is projected on park dedication fees that would go above and beyond that, obviously, right?
Yeah, I assume I have not done that deep dive into that this was what we felt needed to come from the levy absent park dedication funds coming from development. Just a little easy math terms. Our park dedication is 2,500 a lot.
Yep.
And so, yeah, that is good. 187,000, so close to 200,000 a year maybe coming in park dedication fees. It's more complicated than that. If you don't collect under that building permit time, you collect the flat time, so it's a roller coaster. But on average, will we sustain 75 building permits a year for the next 10 years? So all depends on the building economy, right? Could far exceed that, or we could get down to 10. So my assumption is that this number is, just what companies come from a levy, but I can certainly do a little bit more due diligence on that too.
I think the fear on that, or the discussion on that if we take in park dedication dollars, that like the 10-year plan doesn't contemplate any new parks. So it was kind of contemplated that park dedication would help fund the new parks instead of trying to guess what that cost would be or kind of work backwards. It was, what would it take to fund just maintaining what we have? Park dedication would come in, say, in a development and pay for that park. It's kind of that thought that you don't want to back fund your own maintenance.
Is it possible that that 187 is going to be baked into line 5, the license permits fee?
Maybe, but I think that's mostly building permit revenue. We'll do some more due diligence. Yeah, that's a good question.
Next question. In the general property tax fund, I assume that's including commercial businesses, that sort of stuff.
Yeah, that is all the tax, that's essentially what you need to levy, right? So,
And when you look at the chart you had 2 slides ago, in terms of, that's right, Julie, sorry. The average increase in the residential tax at basically $3.99. Are you seeing a significant increase on the commercial side in tax?
it would be similar percentages, so all property taxes are based on valuation. Commercial tax for residential, for basic business, commercial is taxed at twice the normal rate, so 2 times the multiplier on different forms of real estate, right? So apartments, market rate 1.25, affordable is 0.75, residential single families 1, so 1. Businesses, industrial is 2. So the increase sort of hits them double, but the percentage is the same, if that makes sense.
And that's included in that revenue.
Yes, in that general property tax growth.
When we met with the tax people up here a while back, Blake and I, actually, we had a chance to talk to a couple of people. Fiscal disparity tax, that's on commercial property. I noticed on some of our commercial properties, they're taxed this fiscal disparity tax. It's a significant amount of money. Where does that show up on our revenue sheet?
So,
Like for being
yeah. So it's not on revenues, it's, you'll notice that's a negative numbers. And that's, that's what I think you get on here, but I think that's because we are a winner in the fiscal disparity game. But it's not that little expense. It's what happens is that a portion of commercial valuation goes into this pool, this disparity pool. So it's taken out of what we get to tax. And then we get money back from the state, sort of divvied up. It's sort of a redistribution of that wealth, so to speak,
Amongst all the communities.
amongst all the state
But
players,
in
right?
our case, we are at a deficit on that.
Yeah, so I believe this says that we're winning that. Yeah.
It's not all the state, I think it's just.
It might be just bad. I think, yeah, I think it's just bad, yeah.
Yeah, it's our business owners are paying into the pool, but as a city, we're getting, all of that back.
And believe me, I could never even begin to explain that formula. But what I will tell you is that the general idea is that this was invented to help stop cities from tooth and nail clawing each other for businesses. Come over on my side of the border so we get the tax. It was an acknowledgement that business growth is good for everybody, and that why don't we just sort of share in this a little bit and not get each other's throats. Cities still do fight each other for businesses, but it's not as mean as it used to be, because, okay, even if it goes in your city, 40% of that, I think is what the number is, goes into this pool, and then we can all kind of feel good about it. So I'm sure the Woodburys of the world are losing this game, and so the rest of us are
Yeah, I just didn't see that, so
Yep.
thank you for that. It was interesting to learn.
Yeah, and it's a crazy, one of those crazy black boxes. You send stuff off, hope for the best when it comes out. LGA is another one of those that, so there's a formula out there, and we could all read it and pretend to understand it, but, we just kind of wait for the state to tell us what we're gonna get next year. It's been a zero going forward, so.
So. Sorry.
I think I'm winding down. I think I've hit the points I wanted to hit. We need to have. Yes, what's going on with this, so. I'm open to your discussions.
So is there anything here, council, that you look at that comes out on paper, like, we need to give staff direction here sooner than later, it's going to help? That gives you a lot of angst.
Well, I think budgeting for more of these positions, well, I think, the long term is the right thing to do based on the 10-year plan. I mean, given the fact that we have so many open positions today, gives me pause to say, okay, can we even effectively hire that many people and successfully onboard them? I think there are some really key positions that need to get filled sooner than later. As they assimilate and we're ready to next round of hiring, will it be in line with this budget cycle? Maybe. I guess that's the first one that pops up the page. I'm not saying that they're not, needed long term, but timing wise, and I know it's just pushing that increase to the next year. But kind of to the mayor's point earlier, whether it's staff, parks, what have you, there's maybe a limit to how much we should be increasing the budget, around that when we're not actually putting that money in for persons. That's the one that pops off the page, and this level of double-digit increase gives me pause. I look at some of these things that are can we step into more? We've been doing the last couple of years, which I'm sure there's probably some people that came with a look at that. Road parks, for example, but just what it is. And I'd be curious what that policy is for the road parks.
So, Mark, we showed this organizational chart. You want to touch on that based on that question a little bit, or?
Sure. One of the things I made a couple of just red lines. It was literally was my error. Was on that the EDA coordinator and fire inspector, those red positions are not in the 2026 budget. They were not in the 2026 staffing plan. They're in the 2027 staffing plan. And so I had erroneously put them in this chart. The bad news is that doesn't save us any money because they were never in that in there in the first place. So I just want to make that clear that those are not 2026 positions. The rest of these, and we know that I didn't make red boxes, mostly because my graphics skills didn't allow me to. But the plus ones, those are new 2026 positions. Again, new only because they were in the 10-year staffing plan, not something that we just did this year. The deputy clerk position as well. There's some rearrangement of descriptions of what who was what and what kind of a position, but in general, this is a neutral, budget neutral to the 10-year plan, not budget neutral to today, but budget neutral for what the plan increase was. So
Most of the hires are.
yeah, and to your point, like about how many people can be hired on board, I would submit without jumping on Peterson's side here, but they're fully staffed. They are fully staffed right now, right? And so their ability to onboard most people is different than our ability to administration. So I think they could accomplish that this year. And we only have the one position. I think that will be an easy one for us to fill. Dave has the one position in public works. Again, he was very successful at backfilling the promoted position when we get there. So I do think we have that ability. Not saying it doesn't make some sense to look at all of those positions in regard to could they be pushed. And I do think there is some light at the end of the tunnel here, or at least in the short-term tunnel, and that is that page 2 next year is a 5.2% increase. That shouldn't seem low, but that it is lower, right? And so there is some room to smooth that. The next year, the 10.9 is largely based on the total statement. What's sadly we find ourselves that was based on the previous estimate of 20.5. So that number is wrong. You know what? I haven't covered this. So this little handout here want to ask about, our tax rate. So this is, again, a formula that can be a little difficult to understand, for formulas, not all that tough. This is really just the amount that we levy divided by the valuation of our city, the overall taxable market value of our city, divided by a house. So we have a total valuation of, 36 billion, right? Is that right? Billion.
So divided by 1,000.
Yeah. So, 30.4%, excuse me, 41% is what our tax, look at our levy compared to 30 billion, 36 billion, whatever it is. That's 41%, right? So that makes sense here, either here or there, right? What is that number? What it is a way to relatively look at you versus other people in terms of what other cities are charging on a per $100,000 of valuation of someone's property, right? So the same house value in Briar Lake is a lot less taxed. In Stillwater, paying a lot more for that same value. So that's just a relative and way of looking at you compared to other comparable cities. And as you can see here, you're in the middle today. You look back at the financial management plan and look to 2026. Page 2 will show you that number moves with, if you continue with the 16.4, that number would move to close 46%, which oddly doesn't really move you too far. You're still pretty much in the middle of that group, although you start to, you only move down one spot, but you'd still be creeping up towards that nest of the top 4 there. So this number, I wrestle with this a lot. You know, growing cities want to look at this, right? Because it's very hard to grow and keep your tax levy low, right? Because growth means more expenses. So when you're growing, you can't expect a 2% levy increase. It just isn't realistic. You got more than that, just services you need to provide to new residents. So it's a good number to look at when you're growing. But at the same time, I caution it because it can be all over the place. And even if you look at our page 2 of your financial management plan, you know, yes, it goes up, but then you can see the percent increases don't seem to follow any pattern. Like, up 11, up 1, up 6, up 3, up 4. And there's really not a lot of structural things happening in those last 7 years that should affect it. So it is a difficult number to track, and it a lot depends on the denominator, right? So the numerator is us, our expenses. The denominator is our valuation. So if all of a sudden the market goes way up, this number comes way down, right? So that happened recently. You know, all of a sudden everyone's home value went up 20%. That number went way down, right? Sort of hard. Just because the valuation in town goes up doesn't mean our levy has to go up. That's a kind of a common myth people think that they say, well, my valuation went up, my taxes went up. Nope, doesn't have to happen that way. Our levy is what controls how much, okay, right? Yes, it's based on the valuation, but it's just a valuation in general in terms of the relationship with the neighbor.
So, on this 10-year plan, has this, you mentioned that and I know it's a relatively good number, that the public works facility has not, that number reflected here. Has this been updated much at all since Kevin Park? Okay, so I guess hopefully that can happen. We're going to make these decisions and kind of live on this 10-year plan. We really get that down there. But if we're not all tied into this 10-year plan, then it's not. But I think we are, right? Don't want to have these ups and downs with our plan, but that's, I think, important information. Reference this and what our percentage increase. Anything else that pops out that people no go? I mean, you know, if we're going to start first, we're going to start at 16%. No, since tonight and early in the pack word now it's potentially 18% is a direction from council that we're not going to 18, we gotta start at 16, and maybe have that conversation there, or would you be comfortable with even entertaining 18%?
Right. Talk too much. Okay.
I think based on what was presented, I think 18% is, I'm looking at it as 18% is what we're starting with. I don't want to end there by any means. I prefer to definitely come down. I think last year was a comfortable spot, with, as a growing city, around 9 or 10%. That to me, that would be ideal for December. Now that's a lot of money to come down from. One thing that I'd be curious to see for staff is that last year we got a visual of like the recommended, employees that we want to hire. What the purpose was of that, I think that's nice visual for council, but then also for the community. And then if there's an option with next year being 5%, if there's a possibility, I don't know if there is, but to maybe shift a couple of those employees to next year. Again, don't know if that's a possibility. I know that we should do it to next year, but again, next year. And then just seeing what policy is for the million dollars that we have. I think that would be beneficial as a starting point too.
Yeah, I guess I'm fine with starting at the 18, just it enables us to fully understand what kind of the ask is from staff, which is what I wanted to. As I would be curious, Chief, I don't know if you're prepared to speak to this at all, but you know, these additional staff positions, sergeant patrol officers, can you speak a little bit to what's driving that? Is that based on level of service calls? Is it growth? What's
Exactly, yeah, it's the population. So we started putting together some staffing recommendations a few years back, right? And so we put them in for year to year of what the recommendations were. And in my role, it is population growth. We have grown considerably. Housing, increased, the apartments increased, and then naturally just calls for service have increased. So even in the last 5 years, we were at 15,000 calls for service, average. And just this last year, we hit 19,000. And that's with the same staffing levels that we've had for, I believe, 10 years.
Well, my follow-up question is, what does that staffing level look like over the 10 years? We are where we were.
Yep. Yeah. So back in 2014, most remember that we had a police officer that was cut. And then a couple of years later, we were in that position back. So it pretty much put us back to where we were. So that's what that is. Just it was in the staffing recommendations, and then sometimes they came to the city council, and other times it just stopped at the city administrator when each one of the department heads would meet with the city administrator and explain why we were recommending those staff. And sometimes it just never got to you. And other times it was at the city council level where it's like, well, let's not do it this year, let's do it next year. And so that's where you see all four of those positions, somebody pop up this year.
We're forced to make hard choices. Is there a priority to put on the four positions?
They're up. My recommendation, I would never ask for something if I didn't need it, right? And so all four are very much needed, and I think we'd be sitting great. And in a perfect world, it would be great to have all four. But I think the boots on the ground is the big one, the police officers. But the calls for service have increased. That's, I would have to say, it's fine.
So Chief, with that, if your number of full-time equivalents have changed, but the call rate is going up, what's the overtime? That reflects overtime?
So that fluctuates quite a bit too. So as you know, a few years ago, we were down 5 or 6 years ago, I guess. We were down 4 or 5. Some left to go to other departments. Others decided to get out as law enforcement altogether. And and then we also look at sometimes sick time, you know, somebody going up on the leg or something like that. And so, those years really popped up. We needed to still have police officers out there, you know, responding to calls. And then, once we started getting, more kind of fully staffed, that overtime a little bit, or actually quite a bit. So it's kind of, it's up and down.
Project much being savings. They had before hired, and there's, or what's on the ground hired, you could, how much impact on?
I think it would, I can't give you an exact number on that. But also with the calls for service that have gone up and have the same staffing levels, you know, the officers are taking more calls. So instead of being more of a proactive type of, police department, you know, being able to do more traffic, you know, get down community, business owners, you know, those types of things. They're, you know, an average day is you're going call to call. So that would alleviate some of that as well. We have a couple more officers out there. There's more officers to take calls. More direction.
The biggest question people get, I know it's tough to wrap your head around.
So for me, at the end of that sheet, it was this period of time out of that. Correct. More on TV. Yes, so that's well, but for me, quite honestly, yeah, I think I'm comfortable starting with 16%, 80% higher. That's
Well, you know, there's projects of it's hard to imagine.
As I assume as things come up, shoot emails to yourself,
Yes.
that's what the big comfort level is. I know that the idea is I don't want to give anyone false expectations. That's just my concern. Why go from 60? I don't want to do one. It's a lot of work staff has to do. We're going to sit here, try to get this thing down. Sooner we can get a number that we're comfortable with, it's going to be on staff.
That's notes here. I think we'll come back with some additional information. I think this is good job for monitor for this.
Yeah, I do have to say too, last year, I don't know if that's it, but I did enjoy when we did workshops up here and then having to share the Excel sheet. And then we would talk about the numbers and then you could visually see, oh, if we dropped X amount of money in this line item, then what would that do to next year? And then so you could see, like, you know, because next year is 5% better. If we're like, oh, we want to put 2 staff for next year, what would that increase the tax?
Yeah, it was in real time. Yep, that's also look at the chain, you'll see exactly what the effects are. That's the point. That
Yeah,
was
because
that
that
was a way to, and we're working, especially as we get closer to work through that.
Yeah. we made some changes where we were like, ooh, I'm good over next year. I mean, it is fun.
Or for clarification, it's on page 1, the line 50 staff addition, that's at 740. Public safety, got a box around that.
The public safety box does not include the staff additions. That number, the reason I boxed it out is that 7.5 million versus 7.2 million is only a 4%. That's the regular program inflationary increase. I boxed it out because that number will probably go up based on the police contracts that are going up, right? So if that number, if I did the math, to make sure that was really just 4% increase. That's how I was kind of checking. Did they program any larger increase than this for the contract? That number is only 4%. So what that number is, I again, I think I was adding 250 to that number, right? So 800, 7.8, something like that.
So maybe to ask Chief Peters about what anything else, Dave, or how about Want to add this conversation? I have nothing to add.
Well, nothing right now. I'm sure we'll get more into the weeds as we go, but
Yeah.
this is pretty high level.
The other thing, we over the last 2 years, I just part this thing, first year, there was a, as far as capital equipment, we being allowed to talk about this. Last year, there was a little bit, a movement to be able to have those conversations, so I think I would like to see that drill down, if possible, you know, over. Sure. All right, anything else on this? We'll go to the next item. Speed bumps, insert parking lot, wait.
Like that was first or
You want to speak or let us thing present and then?
perfect. And also, as you kind of read in that memo, we received a request, I think it was early last winter, or late fall, about putting some speed bumps in Lakeside Park. At that point in time, we're kind of going through a change order, and Julian and I reached out and said, we got to get this on a workshop. We don't have, one, a policy for taking a petition, and then two, a policy for speed bumps. So took us a while. We finally got on a workshop here and basically just kind of laid out pros and cons of speed bumps, and really just looking for discussion. Would love to hear from them as well, and just kind of what we want to do. So I think we can let them
Yeah,
speak.
would these be, what do you think, these permanent ones, or are they taking out seasonal for farming purposes?
So that would be more of the discussion too,
Okay.
is if you'd want to, rip the street out and put in permanent ones, or have seasonal ones or stuff like that. So I think that's all part of that bigger discussion.
Tim, if you want to get up and say a few words and take your name and address, that'd be great.
Okay, Tim Putnam, 25 Lake Creek Road, the real estate, and under massive. Here's what everything happens. 2 years. So, here comes the thing, so that's what you have to do. Again, Tim Putnam, we're at Park Place, so, within I both serve on a board, this was brought forth, board action, that we sent it over to Dave. And the purpose of it is really to just, bring forth, concern that we have, for the safety of pedestrians, area. So, just a little background, Park was comprised of 17 commercial owners, units, and there are 12 residential units, so there's a lot in and out with business, especially the whole west side of the building is business, first floor is all business, second and third floor are the residents. With that, the other concern that we have is just for, not only for the patrons, people that are coming in and utilizing businesses, but also for the public that's going through the park. And I've got like a lot of visuals in my head of different traffic situations that becomes certain. So, and then, other point of reference, we just recently installed the cameras, in our building. So we get a pretty good visual about what happens. And, realize that, whatever advantage is needed. So to Dave's point, that he had brought up, the pros, that's why we're here, that's what we agree on. And so it's just perspective on the cons. So vehicle damage, again, most of it's label, where those are. We have our thoughts, but of course, land enhancements, regards to that, where they will be. Emergency response. If I think about how few instances that we had for police fire building, it's usually coming from the south, and so it's coming in from a roundabout and coming into our parking lot. Our main entrance for our building is about 150 maybe 200 from the end of Broadway, and so with that, hitting that speed bump is, hitting that speed bump enough on that fast. Usually we go also accessible on the next. So we've got units on Main Street side, as well as a couple of commercial units and some lakeside, those blocking traffic or whatever. Driver frustration, I appreciate that. Again, placement's going to be critical at the learning curve adoption, just with people traveling through. For instance, be sure that we shot earlier, but then I go to our cabin, we go work out at Cross Lake Community Center, and we were there a week ago, and we were just there this last weekend. Like, oh, wait a minute, they put up a couple orders and then speed bumps. They just asked why. They're expanding that whole area for park purposes itself, along the whole way itself. They have a lot of people that shoot through rather fast, so in order to mitigate that problem, they put in speed bumps. The next point that brought up is children, and that they might plan on speed bumps, that one thing. That certainly is probably true. Happen. The alternative is that there's great conflict there. A lot more. There's no reason to pump it. Also with the like, those are removable, so just move them. 2 seconds of work and I mean they're Granger, and they have all the sizes of speed bumps that are very importantly well marked so that people know that they're there. And I think the main thing is this. So people walking out of the building, and I noticed that there is not a crosswalk, so that main road on First Street, there's not a crosswalk out of our building into the parking lot. Speed bumps, which is held in and out of the building. Slow vehicles coming from both directions. Also reference both directions. So if you're coming in off Broadway and the first part of the building, speeds are relatively moderate. But a lot of times what we see is coming from north to the south. So think of like Wallsett Drug is, there's a curve there and then it straightens out. We'll sit out on our deck and just hear people roaring. The other thing too, and this is more of a park situation. We have the same situation going north and south by the park, but especially last night. When someone was showing how fast their car was to their buddies who were on the parking lot, he starts at basically where the trash unit is on the very south end and just races all the way across. And there's just nothing to impede the speed. And you watch and you see kids run out and parents are carrying tons of stuff from the park and maybe out there fishing or something. It really is just an overall safety concern. And that's why that will be a fun place to afford welcome sport. So, to answer any questions and perspective of whatever we appreciate the opportunity.
Thank you. Oh. By this way, Chad, looking for people for talking about the seasonal speed bumps. I don't know. But maybe it's not on that. That's something that in winter time would make it. Problems. I think that's a reasonable approach. I agree. I think speed bumps or some sort of solution is necessary. What's going to keep that from just driving around? They probably have to bring people in the area, travel the area. They found it around a large spike, so it's not something that we're not. Yeah.
Well, the west end closest to the building. Yeah, I'm there. But
Yeah.
very close.
Yeah.
The north end.
The north end. Which
Yeah. Then parts of our-
Random part, yeah, hopefully. Except it's night, we'll probably see the racing. Yeah.
I do favor, I would tell there a lot of about that. I agree that open up the roll set, fast can we go? Or even as their area come towards our office. Every time I back out of there, it's be probably slow as possible, so taking out.
That's kind of I think, I agree with you 100%. I think it's an inexpensive solution, but is there a better solution? You know, can we redesign that parking lot and that road pattern, a driving pattern there that would be more sensible in the long run if we're doing some work in the park anyway versus maybe for now a temporary fix of what it is, but is there something we could do differently? David looked at other options with the driving pattern in there to maybe slow traffic.
Yeah, smart, traffic calming, bump outs or stuff like that, help people down.
But in our downtown plan, there was a call for, that second Chancellor roundabout, kind of on the east side of the park, Maple Parkway.
Yeah,
Which would take traffic off the west side. But that's part of the HOP, so.
right, which is down the road quite a way. Yeah, no, I think that's a solution. I guess I would agree. I know it's extra, there's some downfalls, but just see some on social media and incidents that are happening down there, it's only a matter of time. Something really bad is gonna happen, and if it is, slow traffic down. Chief Peters will tell you that it's accident, or pedestrian or vehicle accidents. So if it's a short-term thing, or we do a long-term plan, I'm open to that, I just think something else. So I would be open to having staff come back with some suggestions, pricing on that, and for something at least. And one of the block came on well, that's true. I mean, you know, I would suggest if there was any second, question to council to provide some of that footage to actually show that, but I don't think we need that. It's no, I would say sex the eyes on with that. Yeah. That, is that Mark's welcome, Mark? We have that.
We're still in talks with them, giving all schedule out, all that, so. Still.
You ready for negative, Dave?
Yeah.
So for years, as long as I've been here in Ryan, up here, we've always turned away speed bumps, just have not allowed them. So negative Dave is gonna say, if we put them on the municipal lot, then you're gonna get a bunch of requests for speed bumps. On major roads, we've kind of pushed away, so I think whether we do this or don't do this, it'll have to be something about within a parking lot or, because I think we're gonna have, if we create a policy where we just allow speed bumps, we're gonna get just hit with everybody wanting a speed bump. So I think we'll have to either create a policy and do it, or they are temporary until something else is figured out or something but I just know from the time Ryan and I have been here, we've gotten a decent amount. So I think they'll come back out of the woodwork and say, well, if they put them here, why not? So I think just one thing that we need to think about, or when we come back, we may propose, it specifically states that it's maybe just in the municipal lot, so I think it's not that negative. I'm just, just fearing the worst, but if that would be all right too, just to kind of spell that out, at least for this circumstance only, or just for this, well, otherwise I think it'll just kind of snowball itself out of control.
Yeah, I think, justified as previously just based on the location, park, small parking lot, right? Some states, someone wanted on the street, front of their townhome or something, but.
I think works the location.
It's David Avenue a bunch of times. We've had a request even back, what is it called now, Shore Side, that road going through there on the back side of Shore Side, in there, the Gun Building. There's been some, they requested on Goodview. So it'll be all your main thoroughfares.
This is a very different scenario.
Yep, I just think that it's kind of just been said that all of a sudden we're gonna be looking at reviewing a whole bunch of other ones where well, the council kind of said, well, we still don't want speed bumps going through town, but in safety situations, we don't want to start slowing traffic down throughout the whole town, putting speed bumps everywhere.
Keep your, preference on seasonal versus long-term?
It depend on the height. I mean, if they're, you see some of them are just massive speed bumps right now, it'd be tough to plow around, but some of them are more gradual, that will still slow traffic down, that you can get up and over, I think. Need to talk over with Ryan and get maybe a cost, what it would cost, put them in with height and then temporary ones, to kind of give a idea that, I mean, it's time consuming too, right? With temporaries, you're driving holes in the ground and say if you put 5, 6 of them in there, you're pulling them all out, put them all back in. So sometimes to have it permanent, if you can get over top of them with plowing equipment, may be a better option. The only downside is if we put them in and then we want to take them out, then you're gonna rip the whole road up. So I think we'll come back with costs and then both options, see what we can talk to that group too and see if they have any comments or or suggestions on certain areas. Ryan and I can look at that as well, just spacing wise. And so obviously you don't want them in drive lane or where the parking lots come out. You want to kind of space them out correctly.
We want a policy and something like that.
Yeah.
Anything else on this one? Thank you for coming tonight. Thank you. Yeah. Item 6. Commissioners and business. Joy.
Thank you. So this will be a little bit easier, not as intense. Looking for council feedback on what I outlined in my staff report. Historically, the city hasn't done a ton of community recognition, and I think that this council and the previous council, that's an important initiative. We have a lot of outstanding members in this community who do a lot of good, and I think that we're always dealing with these heavy topics: budget cuts, 463 actions. Things are pretty heavy and kind of weigh on the council. I think it would be important that in the future here, we look at developing a policy where we can increase community recognition. So I'm looking for some feedback on some potential types of recognition that council would be open to, whether it's just resident recognition, business recognition, which might play into the EDA as well. Youth recognition for our students here at our schools. We have some great schools, some great sports teams who don't really get a ton of attention, but I think it's important that we start recognizing these young folks and their athletic contributions. And then community group recognition. Sometimes Boy Scout troops in the community are going out and doing park cleanup, or in Girl Scout troops as well. We have the beautification committee who does a lot of great work, and just bringing some attention to these groups and doing some formal recognition can really be a big boost to the morale in the community. Different forms of recognition I'd like council to kind of consider: certificates, plaques, proclamations, doing some call outs on our website and our social media, and then inclusion in a future city newsletter. And then looking for council feedback on criteria for recognition, and then a nomination process. So in my staff report, I did include a couple links. I don't know if you were able to look at those, but what a couple other local cities have on their websites. I think White Bear Township, it does a really nice job of kind of laying out their community recognition. So I'm just looking for some discussion just to kind of start this off. Seeing where council wants to go with this, if this is something we want to start bringing forward, maybe in the next few months. With your feedback, I could start to put together a policy and a plan so we can start recognizing these folks in our community who do a lot of good. And I should add, I think it would be important to maybe increase our staff recognition as well. A lot of cities will present certificates or just, verbally recognize staff who've done great things at the city or have been here for, 5 years, 10 years, just different recognition for that staff commitment. So just looking for some discussion, and I'll turn it over to you guys.
Thanks. Since I work in my office, I was in the city council, in right. I actually probably changing was population, see, I feel really interested in that thing, and I thought that was really amazing. All the different things she's been involved with, community. Over 20 years, they actually recognized her and thanked her. They came right from the council. I thought that was really a great idea. And then when I sent it to Jolene, she talked about this with even the students and other people in the community. We have so many great volunteers. I think it'd be a wonderful thing to do. When she talks about the staff, we have this thing in our company where you get a bobber. So you can recognize somebody, just go on the website, click on send them a bobber, send a really nice note of what they did, graduate when it goes to their supervisor. And at the end of the month, they can turn in those bobbers they can select us for a little prize chart, right? Little prizes you can get or little rewards you can get. Not that we have to go that far, but it's kind of a really nice thing to recognize that extra efforts. And anybody can recognize it, whether it's a citizen, whether it's another coworker, or whether it's council members or whatever. That those are really big is, and I think it's something that we don't have here that I think would really be powerful in our community, especially if we can recognize that on websites or however we do that, however we decide.
Yeah. So in my past life, we would bring in these groups to these council meetings and, sports teams and different community ambassadors, because we have community ambassador programs, but it was just a fun way to highlight the positive things that are going on. And I think that it's just such a benefit to the community to draw attention to those. There's so much negative that we see all day long in the news and on social media. Just bringing forward those little glimmers of hope and positivity can make a big difference.
I think it's great. I appreciate, you and I talked a little bit about this, but then made that recommendation, suggestion. To your point, there's only such a great work. And it wasn't good.
Yeah.
So how we can do that, like the vote or the moving will be coming to council. As far as how that process works, I hadn't had a chance to look at those links. You mentioned like our township.
Mm-hmm.
There's something there that just seemed like you get all check all the boxes. That make it release. So it's not staff that's trying to figure this out. I don't know, is there something on those city websites or an application form to submit, right?
There is, yeah. Yeah, and same with New Hope does a really nice job too.
Amazing. They show people they fire your houses at their gardens.
Yep.
That was really cool.
Yeah, they do some really great stuff. And I mean, sometimes it's fun to recreate the wheel, but sometimes it's great just to steal other people's ideas and make them our own and, run with them. But I think anything we can do to bring attention to the positive things going on in this community, it's a step in the direction that I think the community is looking for. And I think this council, just based on what I know from you guys these past few months, I think it's something that would be of value to this council as well.
Our code enforcement officer taking a picture of that good yard.
Yeah. Yep.
Yeah, so I guess is there maybe if there's any after review and I'll go back and review this feedback on seeing those something that you like.
Yeah, just if you could just reach out to me, shoot me an email. Let me know kind of what you're thinking. I don't need you guys to really give me details right now, but just start thinking about it so we can start developing this and, get something off the ground here in the next few months. Maybe at least in time for the new school year with, fall sports starting up. Yeah. Good.
Thank you.
Thanks.
All right. I don't think this evaluation part of it is up to secret. I'm just going to say right now, publicly that I might have opportunity to be involved in one of these operations, like in the city. So when this first came about, I let Mark and Amanda know, I talked to Joanne immediately that going forward from that point, we haven't done anything on this, but from here on out, that is things, all votes and really discussion, to not, that there's any chance that I might be trying to sway people which way or the other. If it ends up that I'm not going to be in this, then I publicly say that I'm not involved in an operation like this. And so with that, Mark will let you, this, I'll start here on this one.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. So this is, this was put on the agenda really just as a sort of much like we had sort of a full session. So, slap in the face. You guys pay attention to that. This is how. I want everyone to be awake for this. The opposite cannabis management is a real thing now. They're really gonna do this. And, you know, I wasn't here for the initial discussions of the city's sort of general attitude towards this. I really have absolutely no predisposition myself. I can see their side of, there's cities I know that are adamantly opposed to doing everything they can to keep it out of their town. People are opening their own municipal cannabis shop right now, welcoming all comers. So, as I understand, your council's general attitude here, we've been a fairly laissez-faire and saying, let's see what happens. Roll with it. Obviously, we've got some sensible regulations in place in terms of radius around schools, all those kind of things. But this is your final warning of harsh word, final notification that the time is now to make any changes to that approach, that posture, because it'll be too late once we get a zoning application. Once that zoning application is plopped down on our table, it's locked in, right? They get told their grandfather didn't, you can change the rules, but they're gonna be on the old rules. So, again, some of the things I wanted to kind of just point out were that we do have radii around schools, playgrounds, daycares. We aren't maxed out on those. The state did set limits. You can't just set ridiculous radiuses. But I think some of the ones that could get involved were at 500, I want to say.
We're 500.
There's a couple of them that could be increased if that was something you wanted to do. You know, I put a map on there. It's a little, you know, it's a little tough to read, but you know, and I do think we actually made an exception because one is very close to downtown. I think the downtown part of it was excluded because it just would prohibit the whole downtown.
Correct. I think it was 250. If I'm just off the top of my head, I think we went with 250 feet in the downtown area. So that those businesses right along Lake Street, you know, between Lake Street and the park wouldn't necessarily be excluded.
A very similar situation in Centerville where the school is plopped right in the middle of downtown. We eliminated the liquor license radius because the only bars in town would have moved in that radius, right? So it's very common that I'm not saying that one I want to point out. I think the biggest one here to tackle is just the number of registrations. Now, this is all complicated terminology that could just follow the regular process of liquor licenses. The state's going to issue the license, we're going to issue a registration. We have the ability to limit the number of registrations. I think in the previous memo it said we had a limit of 2 based on population. I read it as 1. We put down to 1. It's 1 per 1,000. 1 per 12,500.
Correct.
I think it's over 25,000 people. It could be that 1, but it's here or there. It's 1 or 2. Right now we don't have a limit on it. You know, Jolene just, I think, effectively argued to me once in a while that, you know, don't worry, Mark, because there's a limit on how many of these there can be. And for sure, retailers, right? 150 statewide on that one. So will a dozen of those 150 be in our city? Probably for that one, right? The research will be next to 12 other retailers, right? The other ones that don't have limits on micro businesses. As I understand those, it's almost like a group of, right? You do everything in one spot. And course and all that stuff. So, that one's gonna be interesting to see how many of those pop up. Small quantities, doing that kind of stuff. The other ones, wholesalers and transporters, testing and delivery, all are gonna be market driven, and it's not like I don't think anything's necessarily gonna wanna be a hub here. The micro businesses, I can see a number of those popping up. And then, just a reminder that the zoning codes allowing this in the retail districts, or the business districts, and the mixed use district. So, we've got a pretty wide range of zone codes that allow this. And then just to review, the mechanism of this is interim use permit. So rather than conditional use permit, which is a very permanent thing on the property, in interim use permit, so we do have one of the thing. Our attorney told me we'll go down to do that. I think there's going to be challenges with that. People are going to have some time investing in their business on an interim use permit. Build a $1 million building with an interim permit. We would know every time. I think we're going to get a pushback on that when it comes around. If people are just sort of repurposing their existing building, probably not as much, right? But we'll see where that shakes out and see how far we push people with that interim permit. I think the less push people with the ridiculous conditions, less, pushback we'll get on it. But that will be something I want to see played out. But just so we're aware, that's how it's going to work. We'll be doing an interim permit. So basically sort of an ongoing evaluation of it, right? The idea would be, I think, at some point, once this thing all settles out, we see what this is going to look like, start to give people who have established themselves as good business people with a solid operation conditional use permit. One thing that I've yet to see any estimates on is what is coming our way in terms of revenue from all this. I think most of them taking the attitude Joel just took.
Yeah.
We'll get that one, we cross that bridge when we come.
Yeah.
Percent is 10%.
It is.
10% sales tax and 1% of that is coming to the city. I think it's 10%. 10% is coming to cities in general, and that 10% is then divided up by what we think it's going to be divided up by the number of licenses we have in town, but that's yet to be.
Yeah, they're still hashing all that out. I sure did.
So there's a lot of unknowns. Again, this is just a moment of time for me to look everybody in the eyeball and say, you don't have a limit on licenses. Our radius could be bigger. We expect it to fewer zoning districts. There are many opportunities in place here to restrict this further. I'm also looking in the eyeball and saying, I'm not sure I see a big problem with this. Sometimes I wake up and think, oh my God, this is a real problem. You can imagine sort of the seediest types of right. If you see these broken down storefronts, shady businesses. And on the other side, I see tobacco shops and liquor stores just that do just fine. Nobody bothered by it. We'll blend it. I don't know.
I think past councils, the interim use permit was kind of our safety valve.
Yeah.
Why we that direction. And then our other conversations, not limiting the licenses, kind of let it be more permit. But at the end of the day, with the interim use permit, I feel like we have some sense of not control, but safety valve, I guess.
I've got Chief Peterson here. I don't know if Tom, you got to weigh in on this situation or what your general thoughts are. I haven't had a chance to talk about this much, but any thoughts you want to offer?
Last time we really discussed it, it was still something that I still feel we're still not real sure what's going to happen with how it's all going to evolve. So it's, for me, it's pretty control.
Big challenge.
Oh, yeah.
It's a big challenge for any element of this industry. So. We have. I think,
There's odor mitigation requirements in this ordinance.
It's good, it's a, I like to see people open up the store, it's kind of a big shop. So. But anytime we really. Wouldn't be.
Yes, and I don't really have full conversation. But it's new, it's just. But it takes sense.
Oh, that request.
But really, put it all this in context. When I go to bed, you can tell me.
And just a quick heads up, so I'd say that me personally, I've probably had maybe half a dozen inquiries. They've mostly been from existing tobacco shops who said, well, we want to start selling weed. Well, that's not that simple, guys. There's a significant process you have to follow. The few others have been pretty serious and, they're existing business owners in other states. They're looking to move into Minnesota and grow their business here. No pun intended. But I think Abby's probably fielded about a dozen calls from more serious business owners who are looking to get into the market here. So there's definitely interest here in, establishing some businesses here in Forest Lake. So I guess my only caution would be it's easier to expand. And I think this is something that we discussed when council originally considered this. It's easier to expand the number of licenses than it is in the future for us to walk them back, like Mark just said. So, but if council is comfortable with where we're at with the safeguards we put in place with the IUP, I think that's the direction we continue to go in.
Right. Yeah, the state's issuing the licenses. They're gonna run our computer. Or only in some instances.
Only in some instances. Yeah. So like the micro businesses, they didn't put a limit on those. Now, who knows what the state's going to do? I mean, they've gone every which direction in recreating the wheel in the cannabis licensing arena when they could have followed really well-established models in other states. So things could change at the state level in a few years. We don't know. I mean, once this really rolls out, it's anyone's guess on how it's going to go. So retail licenses are limited. They're capped so far, statewide. Mezzo business licenses are capped. But micro businesses are not. And I think that's the one we'll see the most of because I think it's a good business model. So we'll see.
Anything else for us, the council, on this round of group from there?
Full session. Still on the motion to see.
I propose we down 105, started issue 3A, check instructions on. Closed session will be held in the Forest Lake conference room and will commence immediately once the closed session is completed. City council will reconvene the open portion of the workshop. There is no other items on the agenda. Once back in session, the council will adjourn.
Motion second. Awesome. All in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Closed session.